October 14, 1943, 11:37 Central European Time, 20,000 feet above the German city of Schweinfurt. The cold at this altitude is a physical presence. It seeps through sheepskin, through leather, through the electrically heated suits that hum and crackle in the headsets. Inside the plexiglass nose of a B-17 flying fortress, the world is a study in blue, the thin, endless blue of the sky and the distant, hazy blue of the earth below. The air trembles. With the drone of 291 engines, a sound so vast and deep it vibrates in the bones of the men who sit within it. For nearly 2 hours they have flown this heading. For nearly 2 hours they have been dying. The crewmen are young, their average age is 22, some are still teenagers. They left the ground of England in the dark, ate eggs and bacon, were briefed on the flak corridors and the fighter assembly points. Now they are alone, the P-47 Thunderbolts that kissed them goodbye at the German border are long gone, their fuel running low as they turned for home. The Luftwaffe has been waiting, wave after wave of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts have torn at the formations, launching rockets, pouring cannon fire into the boxes of bombers. To the men in the lead ship, the target is still minutes away, but the battlefield is already all around them. A B-17 from the group behind, the 305th, they think, has rolled out of formation, both starboard engines on fire, its wing folding like paper as it tumbles down through the cloud layer. There is no chute from that one. The sky is scribbled with contrails and smoke. The intercoms are a chaos of calm reports and sudden screams. And still the lead navigator keeps his eyes on the drift site, counting the seconds to the initial point, 2 hours over Schweinfurt. For some, it has already lasted a lifetime. For the rest, the worst is yet to come. This is the story of Mission 115, the story of the day the mighty 8th lost its air superiority, the story of Black Thursday. To understand the abattoir in the sky over Schweinfurt, one must first understand the doctrine that sent those men there. In 1943, the United States Army Air Forces were wedded to an idea, the heavy bomber, flying in tight formation and bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, could penetrate any enemy airspace, destroy any target, and fight its way home without the need for long-range escort. The bomber would always get through. This was the gospel of precision daylight bombing, and its high priest was General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force. It was a theory born of peacetime exercises and a deeply held American faith. Technology, the B-17 was the flying fortress, a self-defending battleship of the skies. Its offensive power was immense, its defensive fire, when massed in a combat box of 54 aircraft, was thought to create an impenetrable wall of lead. Against this, the generals believed no fighter force could stand. But the skies over Germany in 1943 were not the ranges over Nevada. The Luftwaffe's Jagdwaffe, the fighter arm, had spent 3 years learning how to kill bombers. They had blooded themselves against the RAF. They knew that the head-on attack was the most effective, exposing the bomber's relatively weak forward armor and giving the pilot a clear shot at the cockpit and the number 1 and 2 engines. They also knew that the bomber's guns had limits. They could not cover every angle at once. Throughout the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force had been pushing deeper and deeper into Germany. They had hit Hamburg, Bremen, and Kiel, but the planners at USSDAF, United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, had their eyes on a specific nexus, a critical choke point in the German war machine. The city of Schweinfurt, nestled in the hills of Bavaria, was home to an industrial marvel. It housed the Kugelfischer and Vereinigte Kugellagerfabriken plants. These factories, along with a few smaller ones, produced an estimated 45 to 52% of Germany's entire output of precision ball bearings. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. Ball bearings were in everything. They were in the engines of every Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf, in the transmissions of every Panzer, in the gears of every lathe that made the guns. Without a constant supply of bearings, the German war economy would grind to a halt. Tanks would seize, aircraft engines would freeze. If the 8th could obliterate Schweinfurt, they could paralyze the Reich from within. It was a panacea target, a single silver bullet that could end the war. From the air, the first attempt came on August 17, 1943. the anniversary of the 8th's first mission. It was a massive, double-pronged attack, one force led by the innovative Colonel Curtis. LeMay would hit the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg and then fly on to North Africa. A second force would hit Schweinfurt. The hope was that the two raids would split the German defenses. The plan failed. Weather delays over England scrambled the timing. LeMay's Regensburg force took off on time, but the Schweinfurt group was stuck on the ground for 3.5 hours by the time the Schweinfurt bombers arrived over Germany. The Luftwaffe fighters that had mauled the Regensburg force had landed, refueled, rearmed, and were waiting for them at altitude. The result was a bloodbath. Of the 376 bombers sent on the dual mission, 60 were lost. The Schweinfurt force alone lost 36 aircraft. The damage to the factories was significant. Production reportedly dropped by 34%. But it was not fatal. The Germans, anticipating such a strike, had stockpiled bearings. They also began the slow process of dispersing their production. In England, the 8th Air Force licked its wounds and counted its losses. The doctrine had been shaken, but it had not broken. The commanders looked at the reports. They noted the 27 German fighters claimed as destroyed. They blamed the weather, the split force, the bad timing. They convinced themselves that if they could send a single, concentrated force of over 300 bombers against Schweinfurt, with better fighter support on the edges, they could destroy the target and still absorb the losses. The math seemed to hold. But the Luftwaffe had been taking notes too. They had watched the formations. They had learned the bombers' vulnerabilities, and in the 2 months since August, they had been given a new weapon, the 21-centimeter Wurfgranate, a bulky rocket tube. Mounted under the wings of their fighters, it was inaccurate, but it was devastating. It allowed a fighter to stand off outside the range of the .50 calibers and lob a time-fused warhead into the tight American boxes. The stage was set for a second act. The planners at 8th Bomber Command's scheduled mission 115 for October 14th. They were sending the bombers back to Schweinfurt. In the pre-dawn hours of October 14, 1943, the airfields of eastern England stirred to life for the men of the 1st and 3rd Bombardment Divisions. It was a routine that had become a grim ritual. Wake up at 300 or 400. A breakfast of powdered eggs, bacon, and hot coffee, perhaps the last warm meal they would ever eat. Then, the briefing. At Thorpe Abbott's home of the 100th Bomb Group, the men shuffled into the windowless briefing hut. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. The curtain over the map was drawn. When the intelligence officer pulled it back, a collective groan or a sharp intake of breath would sweep the room. If the target was in France or the Low Countries, there might be jokes, a little relief, but when the ribbon stretched deep into southern Germany, past Frankfurt, past Wurzburg, to a name that was now synonymous with danger, Schweinfurt, the room fell silent. The men were told the target was critical. They were told the fighter escort would be stronger this time. P-47s would take them all the way to the German border, and P-38 Lightnings would meet them on the way back. They were told to expect heavy flak. They were told to hold formation. As the sun began to lighten the horizon, the ground crews were finishing their work. The bombers were lined up on the hardstands, their silver aluminum skins gleaming in the dim light. Crew chiefs patted the landing gear. Ordnance men had already loaded the bomb bays with up to 5,000 pounds of high explosives and incendiaries. The armorers had fed the belts of .50 caliber ammunition into the twin 50s in the turrets. Then the crews appeared, trudging across the grass in their bulky flight gear. They looked like overstuffed Michelin men, their faces smeared with anti-exposure cream. They carried their parachutes, their escape kits, silk maps, and tiny compasses sewn into their flying jackets and their good luck charms, a rabbit's foot, a pin-up girl, a worn Bible. Engines coughed and spat, then roared to life. Blue smoke plumed across the fields. One by one, the heavy bombers taxied out, a line of steel beasts moving toward the runway. Threshold at 10:00, the first B-17 of the 305th Bomb Group began its takeoff roll, lifting its immense weight into the air. In total, 291 B-17 flying fortresses would climb on that Thursday morning, assembling into their combat boxes in the gray English sky. The Stream of bombers was over 40 miles long, a river of metal flowing toward the Dutch coast. The escort plan was precise. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts from the 56th and 353rd. Fighter groups were to pick up the bombers as they crossed the coast and stay with them until they reached the vicinity of Aachen, near the German border. The P-47 was a tough, fast aircraft, but it was a slave to its thirsty engine, even with external drop tanks. It could not venture much deeper into Germany and still have the fuel to fight its way home. Above the channel, the view was breathtaking. Sunlight glinted off the wings of the fortresses as they tightened into their defensive formations. The lead group, the 1st Air Division, flew at the front, with the 3rd Air Division stacked behind and above. They were a sight to inspire awe and a sight to draw predators. German radar had been tracking the buildup since the first bombers left the English coast. Freya and Wurzburg radars plotted the altitude, speed, and heading of the incoming stream. The controllers of the Luftwaffe's Jag Division, the fighter divisions, watched the plots merge on their tables. They knew this was a big one. They knew the likely targets, perhaps the ball-bearing plants again, perhaps an aircraft factory further east. The alarm went out. Every available fighter in Western Germany and the occupied territories was ordered to its assembly points. The circus was about to begin. As the bombers crossed into the Netherlands, the first swarms of German fighters appeared, hovering just out of range. They were timing their attack, waiting for the P-47s to reach their fuel limit and turn back. The Luftwaffe had learned the rhythm of these missions. They knew the exact moment when the big American fighters would have to disengage. That moment was coming. Inside the B-17s, the waist gunners and tail gunners tracked the distant specks with their eyes, their throats dry. The radio silence was broken by the calm, tense voice of a pilot. Bandits at 10 o'clock high. The 2 hours of hell were about to begin. Inside the aluminum skin of a B-17, the world shrank to a tube of noise and cold. For the 10 men, there was no evasive action to take, no control over their fate beyond the maintenance of formation. They were cogs in a machine, suspended in a vacuum. The pilot flew on the lead ship, his eyes fixed on the wing of the aircraft ahead, ignoring the flak bursts that jolted the plane like a giant fist. The co-pilot watched the instruments, his hand on the throttle quadrant, feeling the vibration of 4 engines. The navigator and bombardier huddled in the plexiglass nose, the most exposed position, with a panoramic view of the enemy closing in. The flight engineer in the top turret just behind the cockpit was a gyroscope of violence, his body rotating with his guns as he tracked fighters slashing through the formation. The radio operator listened to the chatter, a helpless spectator. The waist gunners, standing at open windows with the 60 below zero wind screaming through, swung their 50s in arcs that grew wider as the attacks intensified, and the ball turret gunner, often the smallest man on the crew, was curled in a fetal position in a plastic bubble under the belly of the plane, the absolute lowest point in the formation, watching the ground wheel by far below and the fighters zoom up to gut him. It was a position of profound psychological terror. He could not get out on his own if the hydraulic system failed. He could only shoot and pray. This was the human geometry of the combat box. It was a system designed to create a wall of fire, but it was also a system that concentrated fear into an almost unbearable pressure. The Luftwaffe that rose to meet the Americans on October 14th was a different beast than the one that had contested the August raid. The lessons of the summer had been learned and encoded into new tactics. The Germans no longer simply dove into the teeth of the bomber stream. They had perfected the Staffel formation attack. Squadrons of Focke-Wulf 190s, often armed with the new BR-21 rockets, would approach from ahead and slightly above, just out of .50 caliber range. At a signal from the leader, they would ripple-fire their rockets into the dense combat boxes. The rockets were not precision weapons. They relied on mass and fragmentation. A single hit could shear off a wing or tear a gaping hole in the fuselage or ignite the fuel tanks. The tactic was designed to break up the formations. Once a bomber lagged, streaming smoke or oil, it was a dead man. The more agile Messerschmitt Bf-109s would then pounce, picking off the wounded, concentrating their fire on an engine or the cockpit. It was a brutal, efficient system of slaughter. Over the Netherlands, the fighters of Jagdschwader 1 and 26 hit the trailing elements of the 3rd Air Division, the 305th. Bomb group flying in the vulnerable low position was decimated in a matter of minutes. 13 of its 16 bombers fell from the sky. They did not tumble gracefully. They exploded or spun or came apart in pieces, leaving only a smear of smoke and a flutter of aluminum in their wake. The tactic had worked. The box was broken. The B-17 was a marvel of engineering, a testament to American industrial power, but it was also, in the context of deep penetration raids, a trap the aircraft could absorb. Tremendous punishment. Crews told stories of planes coming home with tails nearly shot off, with holes you could crawl through, with 2 engines dead. But this ruggedness came at a cost. The bomber was slow, and its formation tactics required it to fly straight and level for minutes at a time on the bomb run, presenting the perfect target for German flak. The 88 guns ringing Schweinfurt were radar-directed, fused to burst at the precise altitude of the bombers. The sky over the target turned black with smoke and fire. Shrapnel sliced through aluminum and flesh with equal ease. The Norden bombsight, that secret wonder weapon that was supposed to put bombs into pickle barrels, was useless if the plane was bouncing through flak or dodging fighters. For those brief, eternal minutes over Schweinfurt, the technology of the offense was completely outmatched by the technology of the defense the Germans were using. Predictive radar plotting, massed rocket barrages, and cannon-armed fighters. The Americans were relying on .50 caliber bullets and the hope that their formation would hold. In England, the commanders waited. General Eaker and his staff at Bomber Command Headquarters followed the mission by the fragmentary reports coming in from the escort fighters and the intercepts of German radio traffic. They knew the scale of the battle was immense. They knew the fighters had turned back. And then the silence. For hours there was nothing but the hum of the teleprinters and the anxious pacing of men who had sent a quarter of their bomber force into the maw of the German war machine. The doctrine of the unescorted bomber was on trial. In the briefing rooms, it had all made sense: the statistics, the overlapping fire, the calculated loss rates. But statistics did not scream over the radio. Statistics did not freeze to death in a crippled bomber over France. From the command perspective, the raid was a mathematical equation. But as the first reports of the losses began to trickle in, first 20, then 30, then 40, then 50, the equation was failing. General Arnold in Washington would later call the losses incidental, but the men in England, watching the clock and counting the empty hardstands, knew the truth. They had sent 291 bombers to war. A significant number of them were never coming home. The men in the bombers did not think about ball bearings. They thought about staying alive, but the targeting officers who had selected Schweinfurt carried a different burden. They believed genuinely that destroying these factories would shorten the war. It was a moral calculus of a different kind. If 600 airmen died but saved tens of thousands of lives by crippling the Wehrmacht, was it worth it? The question haunted the planners. And yet the intelligence was flawed. The Germans had stockpiled bearings. They had sources in Sweden and Switzerland. The single panacea target did not exist. The men were dying for a theory that was, at its core, unsound, as the bombers fought their way back across Germany, their bomb bays empty, their wounds bleeding. The moral weight of the mission began to shift from the hope of victory to the simple, brutal fact of survival. The bombers reached the initial point at Schweinfurt just before 14:30 hours. For the lead bombardier of the 1st Air Division, peering through the crosshairs of the Norden sight, the world narrowed to a single point on the ground. The flak was at its most intense here. The Germans had thrown a ring of steel around the city. The bursts were so close and so numerous that the bombers rocked and bucked as if sailing through a hurricane. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, even at 20,000 feet. The 305th Bomb Group, or what was left of it, was in no shape to bomb accurately. They had lost their formation integrity, but the groups behind them pressed on. At 14:39, the first bombs tumbled from the bays of the lead wing. The bombardiers toggled the switches, feeling the lurch as 500-pound general-purpose bombs and incendiaries fell away arcing down through the smoke toward the sprawling complexes below. For a moment, the fighters seemed to part. The German pilots knew better than to fly through the flak that was about to smother the bombers. The Americans had a brief, blessed respite to do their job. On the ground, the city of Schweinfurt was dying. The bombs walked across the factory roofs. The Kugelfischer plant took multiple hits. The VKF plants were obscured by smoke and flame. Machine shops collapsed. Office buildings were gutted. Workers, many of them forced laborers from occupied countries, huddled in shelters or were caught in the open, torn apart by the rain of steel. The historical record notes that 229 of the 291 bombers successfully dropped their ordnance on the city area and the bearing plants. 424 tons of bombs fell in those few minutes. But as the last bomb left the last bay, the respite ended. The German fighters, having landed at forward airfields to refuel and rearm during the bombing, were back. They hit the now disorganized formations with renewed fury. The 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, was caught in a vicious crossfire. They lost 9 aircraft on this day. Adding to their grim legend, the 306th Bomb Group was shattered. Of the 15 bombers that had departed thoroughly that morning, only 5 would return. The sky became a funeral pyre. Shoots blossomed here and there, signs of life leaving the stricken machines, but for every shoot, there were 10 men still trapped inside a falling coffin. The navigators reset their courses for home, but home was 3 hours and another 200 miles of enemy airspace away. The Luftwaffe was not done. They stalked the stream all the way to the coast. A B-17 from the 92nd Group, its tail control surfaces shredded, struggled to maintain altitude. The pilot held the shuddering wheel, fighting the physics of destruction. He had dead and wounded men on board. He had a gaping hole in the fuselage where the radio room used to be. He had to get them out. The return flight was a gauntlet of isolated horror. Formations had been shattered. Low bombers or pairs of bombers limped toward the coast, easy prey for any German fighter with ammunition to spare. The Luftwaffe fighters, many now low on fuel, themselves continued to press attacks, determined to turn the retreat into a rout. They savored the kill. In the shattered remnants of the 306th Bomb Group, the crew of B-17 4230811 piloted by 1st LT Ralph Peters was fighting for its life. They had taken rocket hits over the target. The left wing was damaged, forcing them to salvo their bombs early just to stay in the air. Then the flak had found them. The aircraft was dying around them. LT Peters gave the order no pilot ever wants to give: bail out. One by one, the 10 men of the crew jumped into the enemy sky over Germany, their chutes opening to the sight of a burning city and the sound of distant engines. All 10 survived the jump. All 10 were immediately captured. They were the lucky ones. Others were not so fortunate. The cold was a killer. Men with wounds, men with oxygen systems shot out, simply passed into unconsciousness and never woke up. The waste gunners, exposed to the slipstream, nursed their wounds in silence, watching the blood freeze on their flight suits. The ball turret gunners, trapped in their bubbles, were the last to know if the landing gear would work, if the hydraulics were still intact. As the battered formations finally reached the Dutch coast, a new horror awaited. The flak crews on the islands were waiting. They had been tracking the slow, low, damaged bombers for miles. The sky over the coastline turned black again. One B-17 so riddled it looked like a skeleton, took a direct hit in the fuel tank just as it reached the water. It exploded in a ball of fire, the pieces spinning down into the cold gray sea. It was the 60th bomber to fall that day. Finally, mercifully, the lightnings and thunderbolts appeared, P-38s from the 55th Fighter Group, which had been waiting for this moment, dove into the scattered German fighters, driving them off. The surviving bombers were safe. They were over the water. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and shock. Back in England, the bases began to prepare for the returns. The ambulances lined the runways. The crash crews stood by. The first bombers appeared as specks on the horizon. Some flew in formation, proud and intact. Others staggered in alone, smoking, their props feathered, their landing gear hanging precariously. At Thorpe Abbotts, the 100th waited. At Thurley, the 306th waited. At Bassingbourn, the 91st waited. The Counting began. At Thurley, the scene was one of devastation. The 306th had sent 15 bombers, only 5 returned. The field was silent as the reality sank in. 100 men were not coming back. At other fields, the story was the same. The 305th had been virtually wiped out, losing 13 of 16, with 130 men gone. The ambulances did not stop. The chaplains began their long, sad walk to the hardstands where the crews should have been. The last bomber landed just before dusk. The mission was over, but the counting was just beginning. The numbers, when they were finally tallied, were staggering. Of the 291 B-17s that had departed English bases that morning, 60 had been shot down over Europe, but the butcher's bill did not end there. Another 17 bombers were so badly mangled that they crash-landed upon return or were written off as scrap, damaged beyond economic repair. 121 more bombers returned with damage, holes in wings, shattered plexiglass, dead engines. Only 33 bombers landed without a scratch. In human terms, the cost was incalculable. Of the approximately 2,900 airmen who had climbed into those bombers, 594 were listed as missing in action. They were the ones who went down with the planes or who jumped into the darkness and were never seen again. 65 men were confirmed as prisoners of war. Another 5 were killed and 43 wounded aboard the bombers that did make it home. The total loss in aircrew was over 650 men, 22% of the entire attacking force. In a single afternoon, the 8th Air Force had lost more men than the U.S. Army Air Forces had lost in the entire first year of the war in Europe. The Luftwaffe's losses, in contrast, were relatively light. They admitted to losing between 35 and 38 fighters, with another 20 damaged. The American gunners, in the heat of battle, had claimed 186 German aircraft destroyed, a wildly optimistic number that spoke to the chaos and terror of the fight. The disparity was brutal. For every German fighter lost 2 American bombers, 20 American airmen had been killed or captured. At the airfields that night, the mess halls were half empty. The bunks were cold. The personal effects of the missing men were collected and stored. The Red Cross served coffee and donuts to hollow-eyed survivors who could not stop shaking. They replayed the mission in their heads, the face of the tail gunner in the plane next to them. As it exploded, the sound of a rocket tearing through aluminum, the voice of the pilot calling Mayday until the signal cut off. The senior commanders tried to put a brave face on it, initial reports as they had after. The August raid focused on the damage done to the target. Reconnaissance photos would later show that the ball-bearing plants had been hit hard. Production was temporarily paralyzed, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The Germans would have those factories running again in weeks. They would disperse the machinery to towns and villages across the countryside, making them harder to hit. The strategic impact was fleeting, but the operational impact was immediate and profound. General Eaker and his staff looked at the numbers and realized they could not do this again. The 8th Air Force had lost over 20% of its heavy bomber strength in a single mission. If they continued such raids, the entire bomber force would be annihilated within a month. The doctrine of the unescorted bomber was dead. It had been killed in the skies over Schweinfurt. The official history of the Army Air Forces would later state it bluntly. The fact was that the 8th Air Force had for the time being lost air superiority over Germany. It was a shocking admission. The mighty 8th, the most powerful bomber force ever assembled, could not defend itself. For the men on the line, the survivors, the news came down from the top. Deep penetration raids into Germany were suspended. The target folders for Leipzig, for Berlin, for the heart of the Reich, were pushed to the back of the filing cabinets. For the next 4 months, the 8th Air Force would only attack targets within the range of fighter escort. They would bomb the coast, the Ruhr Valley's fringes, the factories in France and Belgium. They would rebuild. They would wait. It was a tacit admission of defeat. The Luftwaffe had won this round. They had proven that a determined defense, with the right tactics and technology, could break the back of a daylight bombing offensive. The pause that followed Black Thursday was the longest halt in the American strategic bombing campaign of the war. But the Americans learned. The suspension was not a surrender, it was a reorganization. While the bombers rested, the fighter pilots trained. The P-51 Mustang, a beautiful, agile long-range fighter, was finally coming into its own, with its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and the ability to carry drop tanks. The Mustang could fly all the way to Berlin. And back, the doctrine was being rewritten. The job of the fighters was no longer just to escort the bombers to the target and back. Their new job, as envisioned by men like General Kepner and later General Doolittle, was to go hunting. They would not wait for the Luftwaffe to come to the bombers. They would go to the Luftwaffe and destroy it in the air and on the ground. The men who survived Black Thursday would carry the memory with them forever. They would return to the fight in 1944, when the Mustangs cleared the skies and the bombers finally had their revenge, but they never forgot that autumn day when they learned the terrible price of a flawed idea. In April 1945, as the war in Europe ground to its bloody conclusion, the U.S. Army's 42nd Rainbow Division marched into Schweinfurt, the city that had cost so many American lives was finally in American hands. The division commander, Major General Harry J. Collins, ordered a Nazi banner captured from the city to be sent to the 8th Air Force. He attached a note. It read, "The Rainbow has avenged your losses at Schweinfurt in the summer of 1943. It was a small gesture, a belated apology from the ground pounders to the flyboys, but for the families of the 650 men lost on October 14th, for the empty chairs at the dinner tables in Iowa and Ohio and Texas, there was no vengeance. There was only the cold, hard memory of a Thursday in October when the sky fell down." The second raid on Schweinfurt stands as a monument to the limits of air power. It was a day when technology met reality, when doctrine met defiance, and when the theory of the unescorted bomber was burned away in the fires of a German autumn. The lesson of Black Thursday is not that the bomber will always get through. The lesson is that men are not machines and courage has a limit. The crews who climbed into those B-17s knew the odds. They knew the fighters would be waiting. They knew the flak would be thick, and yet they went. They held formation. They dropped their bombs. They fought their way home. In that, there is a different kind of victory, a victory of the human spirit over the terror of the void. The raid forced a change. It broke the old strategy and forced the creation of a new one. From the ashes of Schweinfurt rose the P-51 Mustang, the long-range escort, and the strategy of air superiority that would pave the way for D-Day. The men who died on October 14, 1943, did not win the battle, but their sacrifice taught the generals what the bombers could not do, and in that lesson they helped win the war. The sky over Schweinfurt is silent now. The flak batteries are gone. The factories have been rebuilt and rebuilt again. But on a clear October day, when the light is right and the clouds form in long contrails, one can almost hear it, the drone of 291 engines, the chatter of 50 calibers, the last whispered prayer of a 22-year-old waste gunner looking out at the endless sky, wondering if anyone back home will remember his name. They should. Black Thursday, a day of loss, a day of learning, a day that changed the air war forever.